The conference room at the Chateau Laurier in Ottawa had been reserved under a neutral designation. No flags, no media presence, no advance announcement to the press. Just two negotiating teams, one long mahogany table, and a stack of documents that had been sitting in a climate-controlled archive beneath the Canadian Parliament buildings for 39 years. The Americans arrived first. President Donald Trump, flanked by three trade advisors and two attorneys carrying a leather portfolio containing what he described in the elevator ride-up as the final word on this whole thing. The Canadians arrived 6 minutes later. Prime Minister Mark Carney, two senior trade officials, and a parliamentary archivist named Dr. Eleanor Voss carrying a single accordion folder bound with red string. Trump opened his portfolio immediately. Carney waited, and in the 11 seconds of silence that followed, before anyone spoke, the entire trajectory of the meeting was already determined. Because Trump had brought a contract, but Carney had brought receipts. What those receipts documented, why they had been preserved for nearly 4 decades, and what happened when they were placed on the table will become clear. But first, you need to understand what Trump believed he was walking into. On the morning of June 8, 2026, Trump announced via Truth Social that he would be traveling to Ottawa for what he called emergency clarification talks regarding the Canada-US softwood lumber trade dispute. The dispute had been escalating for 6 weeks. Canada had imposed export quotas on lumber shipments to the United States after Trump threatened 35% tariffs on Canadian wood products. American home builders were facing supply shortages. Construction costs had spiked 22% in 3 weeks. Lumber futures had reached historic highs. And Trump, facing pressure from Republican governors in 6 states, had decided to force resolution through direct confrontation. He brought with him a printed copy of the 1996 Softwood Lumber Agreement, annotated in red ink, with sections highlighted that he claimed gave the United States unilateral authority to set import quotas during supply emergencies. The document was 47 pages. Trump's team had prepared a 12-page addendum asserting that Canada's export restrictions violated the agreement's core provisions. The strategy was straightforward: present the contract, demand compliance, threaten arbitration if Canada refused. It was a tactic Trump had used in real estate negotiations for 40 years. Show up with the paperwork. Declare victory before the other side can respond. Force them to argue on your terms. But Carney was not a real estate developer, and the Canadians were not unprepared. The meeting began at 2:17 p.m. Eastern Time. Trump opened by sliding the annotated 1996 agreement across the table. "Everything you need to know is in here," he said. "You're in violation. We're within our rights. And if you don't lift the quotas in 72 hours, we're taking this to binding arbitration, and you're going to lose." His tone was firm. His posture was confident. He leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, the physical stance of someone who has just delivered a checkmate and is waiting for the opponent to acknowledge it. Carney did not touch the document. He glanced at it briefly, then looked at Dr. Voss, who placed the accordion folder on the table and untied the red string. The folder contained 11 documents, each sealed in a protective plastic sleeve, each tagged with an archive reference number and a date. The oldest was dated April 14, 1987. The most recent was dated September 22, 1991. All of them were internal memoranda, cable transcripts, and meeting minutes from the Reagan and Bush administrations. And all of them documented, in meticulous detail, a pattern of American non-compliance with a previous softwood lumber agreement that predated the 1996 treaty Trump was now invoking. Dr. Voss removed the first document. It was a U.S. Department of Commerce internal memo dated April 14, 1987, stamped confidential in faded red ink. The memo, addressed to the Assistant Secretary for Trade Policy, outlined a strategy to delay implementation of a 1986 bilateral softwood lumber agreement by reclassifying Canadian lumber exports as unfinished goods rather than finished lumber, thereby exempting them from agreed-upon tariff structures. The memo was 4 pages. The relevant section, which Dr. Voss read aloud in a flat, clinical voice, stated, "By maintaining the unfinished goods classification for an additional 18 to 24 months, U.S. producers gain time to adjust pricing strategies without triggering the agreed-upon Canadian export tax. The reclassification is legally defensible under domestic review procedures and delays Canadian enforcement mechanisms indefinitely." Trump interrupted. "That's 40 years old. It has nothing to do with the current agreement." Carney responded without raising his voice. "It has everything to do with the current agreement, because the 1996 agreement you're invoking was negotiated to replace the 1986 framework, which the United States violated systematically for 5 years before it collapsed. And the violations are not allegations. They are documented in your own internal records." Dr. Voss removed the second document, a cable transcript from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, dated June 3, 1988. The cable, sent to the American Embassy in Ottawa, instructed diplomats to slow-walk Canadian requests for compliance data on lumber import volumes, citing administrative processing delays that would prevent verification of agreed-upon quotas for a minimum of 11 months. The cable included a handwritten note in the margin: "Canadians cannot enforce what they cannot measure." Trump's lead attorney, seated to his right, leaned forward. "Where did you get these documents?" Carney answered, "They were provided to the Canadian government in 1994 during discovery proceedings related to the collapse of the 1986 agreement. They have been archived in the Parliamentary Records Office ever since. We've had them for 32 years. We simply had no reason to reference them until you arrived here today claiming that Canada has a history of violating softwood lumber agreements. So we thought it might be useful to review the actual history." The stakes Trump had walked into were now inverted. He had come to Ottawa to force Canadian compliance by invoking a binding agreement. But the Canadians had responded by documenting that the United States, under two previous administrations, had systematically violated the predecessor agreements that formed the legal and diplomatic foundation for the treaty Trump was now demanding Canada uphold. The 1996 agreement contained a clause, Section 14, Paragraph 3, that stated, "Either party reserves the right to suspend obligations under this agreement if the other party is found to have engaged in material non-compliance with previous bilateral trade frameworks governing the same sector." Trump's own attorneys had never flagged the clause because it had never been invoked, but Carney's team had built their entire defense around it. And the receipts Dr. Voss was placing on the table, one by one, were the evidence required to trigger suspension. Dr. Voss continued, "Document 3, a Department of Commerce memo from October 1989 instructing field inspectors to undercount Canadian lumber shipments at 3 border crossings in Montana and Idaho, reducing reported import volumes by an estimated 14% and allowing American lumber producers to avoid triggering the quota ceilings agreed to in the 1986 framework." Document 4, a summary report from a U.S. interagency task force in March 1990, acknowledging that reclassification delays had cost the Canadian government approximately $340 million in foregone export tax revenue, and recommending that the delays continue until political pressure necessitates resolution. Document 5, a memo from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative in September 1991, 9 months before the 1986 agreement officially collapsed, stating explicitly, "We have extracted maximum advantage from the current framework. Transition to a new agreement structure allows us to reset terms without admitting prior non-compliance." Each document was read aloud. Each was time-stamped, archive-referenced, and marked with the official seal of the U.S. agency that produced it. And each one demonstrated a deliberate, coordinated strategy by the United States to delay, undercount, and administratively obstruct the enforcement mechanisms of an agreement it had signed in good faith. The pattern was undeniable. And the fact that these records had been sitting in a Canadian archive for 3 decades meant that Canada had always known. They had simply waited for the right moment to use them. Angela Briggs is 61 years old. She has worked as a lumber mill supervisor in Terrace, British Columbia for 34 years. Every morning, she walks the production floor with a clipboard, checking moisture levels and grading logs before they go to the saws. Every Friday, she drives to the same diner in town and orders the same breakfast: eggs over easy, rye toast, black coffee. On June 7th, the day before Trump's Ottawa meeting, Angela received a call from her regional manager. The call lasted 4 minutes. The message was simple: the export quotas Canada had imposed were not punitive. They were corrective. And the correction was based on legal research that had been prepared years in advance, waiting for the moment when the United States would overreach. Angela asked what that meant for her mill. Her manager said, "It means we've been playing by rules they violated for a decade, and now they're demanding we follow rules they wrote after they broke the old ones. And we're not doing it anymore." Angela hung up the phone and stared at the production schedule on her wall. Her mill employed 140 people. It shipped 60% of its output to U.S. markets. The quotas would reduce shipments by 40% for at least 6 months. Jobs would not be cut, her manager had assured her, because the Canadian government was redirecting lumber exports to Asian and European buyers who had been underbid by U.S. demand for years. But the larger point, the one Angela understood immediately, was that Canada was not backing down. Not because of rhetoric, not because of pride, because they had the receipts. And receipts, in a trade dispute, are the only currency that matters. The meeting in Ottawa continued for another 90 minutes, but the outcome was decided in the first 20. Trump's attorneys attempted to argue that the documents Dr. Voss presented were irrelevant because they predated the current agreement. Carney's lead negotiator responded by reading aloud from Section 14, Paragraph 3 of the 1996 agreement, the clause that allowed either party to suspend obligations if prior non-compliance was documented. Trump argued that the clause had never been invoked and therefore set no precedent. Carney replied, "It has never been invoked because Canada has never had reason to invoke it. Until now. You arrived here with a contract and accused us of violating it. We responded with evidence that the United States violated the predecessor agreements that this contract was written to replace. That evidence is not debatable. It is your own records. And under the terms of the agreement you brought here today, we are within our rights to suspend our obligations until a neutral arbitration panel reviews the history of compliance by both parties. That process will take a minimum of 18 months. During that time, our export quotas remain in place." Trump stood. He gathered the annotated 1996 agreement and placed it back in his portfolio. He said, according to two sources present in the room, "This is not over." Carney remained seated. He did not respond. The meeting concluded at 4:03 p.m. No joint statement was issued. No press conference was held. Trump departed Ottawa 70 minutes later without speaking to reporters. The consequences unfolded across three sectors simultaneously. First, the legal sector. By June 10th, two international trade law firms had published analyses concluding that Canada's invocation of Section 14, Paragraph 3 was legally sound, and that Trump's demand for immediate quota removal had no enforceable basis under the 1996 agreement. The analyses were based entirely on the documents Canada had archived since 1994, documents the U.S. had provided during prior dispute resolution and then apparently forgotten. Second, the political sector. Republican governors in Montana, Idaho, and Washington publicly broke with Trump, calling for immediate negotiation rather than arbitration, fearing that a prolonged legal battle would lock in Canadian export restrictions for years. One governor, speaking on background to the Wall Street Journal, said, "He walked into a room thinking he had leverage and walked out realizing they've had a file on us since before I was in office. That's not leverage. That's a trap." Third, the market sector. Lumber prices, which had spiked on the expectation that Trump would force Canadian compliance, collapsed 19% in 4 trading days once it became clear that Canada's quotas were legally defensible and would remain in place indefinitely. American homebuilders, caught in the middle, began sourcing lumber from European suppliers at 31% higher cost than pre-dispute Canadian prices. The economic damage was measurable: $11 billion in delayed residential construction projects, 74,000 jobs in the housing sector placed on hold, and mortgage rates ticking upward as builders passed costs to buyers. Warren Buffett, asked during Berkshire Hathaway's annual shareholder meeting on June 14th whether he had been following the Ottawa meeting, responded with characteristic brevity, "When you walk into a negotiation with a contract and your opponent walks in with a file folder from 1987, you've already lost." Because they didn't just prepare for this meeting. They prepared for this meeting 30 years ago, and that tells you something important. It tells you they've been ready for you to overreach since before you knew what overreach was. The audience laughed. Buffett did not. He continued, "Preparation compounds, so does arrogance. One of those is a balance sheet asset. The other is a liability you don't see until the bill comes due." The signature phrase did not emerge from the Ottawa meeting itself. It emerged 3 days later, during a Canadian parliamentary session on June 11th, when an opposition member asked Prime Minister Carney whether he believed Trump had been adequately prepared for the negotiation. Carney paused. He looked directly at the questioner, and then he said, in English, slowly and clearly, "He showed up with a contract. We showed up with receipts." The contract said what he wanted it to say. The receipts said what actually happened. 14 words. The sentence structure was symmetrical. The contrast was absolute. And the phrase captured, with surgical precision, the dynamic that had played out in that Ottawa conference room. Trump had brought evidence of what he believed the rules were. Carney had brought evidence of what Trump's own government had actually done. And in a legal dispute, receipts outweigh contracts. Every time. The phrase was translated into French within the hour. It appeared in Le Devoir under the headline, "Les reçus l'emportent sur les contrats." It was quoted in The Guardian, The Globe and Mail, The Australian, and Frankfurter Allgemeine. It was referenced in a New York Times editorial titled, "The Archive Canada Kept and Trump Forgot." And in every context, in every language, the phrase carried the same message. Trump had tried to impose terms through legal authority, but Canada had responded with historical evidence that undermined the very foundation of that authority. The contract was only as strong as the compliance history behind it. And the compliance history, documented in meticulous detail in 11 plastic sleeve documents from 1987 to 1991, proved that the United States had violated the agreements it was now demanding Canada uphold. By June 18th, Trump had not returned to Ottawa. The Canadian export quotas remained in place. The U.S. had formally requested arbitration under the terms of the 1996 agreement, triggering an 18-month review process that would examine both parties' compliance history dating back to 1986. Legal experts predicted that the review would result in either a complete rewrite of the bilateral lumber framework or the collapse of the 1996 agreement entirely, leaving both nations to negotiate from scratch. Either outcome meant years of uncertainty, restricted exports, and elevated prices. And all of it could have been avoided if Trump had done what Carney had done: prepare. Trump had believed that showing up with a contract would force compliance. He had believed that legal authority, printed on official stationery and highlighted in red ink, would compel Canada to capitulate. He had believed that the sheer weight of American economic power would override any objection Canada might raise. But Carney had not objected. He had documented. And the difference between objection and documentation is the difference between rhetoric and evidence. Rhetoric can be dismissed. Evidence cannot. The Canadians had known, for 32 years, that the United States had systematically violated the 1986 Softwood Lumber Agreement. They had kept the records. They had archived them. They had cross-referenced them. They had waited. And when Trump arrived in Ottawa, confident and unprepared, carrying a contract that assumed Canadian compliance without examining American history, they placed the receipts on the table. Not as a counter-threat, not as leverage, as fact. And facts, once documented, cannot be negotiated away. Trump tried to rewrite the rules of a decades-old trade relationship by asserting legal authority he assumed was absolute. Instead, he learned that authority is only as credible as the history that supports it. And the history, documented in 11 faded memos and cable transcripts sealed in plastic sleeves, proved that the United States had violated the very agreements it was now invoking to force Canadian compliance. He showed up with a contract. They showed up with receipts. The contract said what he wanted it to say. The receipts said what actually happened. And in the end, the only thing that mattered was what actually happened. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe my channel for daily updates.